big one.
today. It's our 5th bill, so yeah.
They can't hold it up.
Yeah, and it's probably the most complicated of all of those. So we're back GovOps on the 4th of April. And Abby, you haven't been with us yet. Yeah, we'll introduce ourselves, even though you might know us, but I'm Senator Hardy from the Addison District.
Olivia Parker, Senator Tanya Buhovsky, Chittenden Central.
Senator Rebecca White from the Windsor County District.
Bob Norris, Franklin District.
Dan Watson, Washington District.
Great. And this is Senator Clarkson, who's reporting on the housing bill upstairs. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
So for the record, Abby Shepherd, Office of Legislative Counsel. Do you like to have witnesses share screens?
I don't think you need to, because we have the paper copy plus we have our computer. So,
Okay.
yeah, so.
I will actually use them as well. So there are 3 documents under my name. I will start with actually just a general overview, and then I can either walk you through the section by section or the timeline. I provided both because it is a fairly complicated bill with effective dates that are sort of all over the place, but very important to the way the bill unfolds.
Okay.
So I'll start with just explaining the general purpose and then what brought this bill about, all of the big questions that it tends to answer, and what it is sort of pushing out a few years in those effective dates, because that's an important part of how this all functions together.
Okay.
So in the immediate term, probably the most sort of urgent issue that this is addressing, many of you've probably heard about the CLA, the common level of appraisal. So we're in the property tax world here. And as properties have increased in value, particularly during the pandemic, this has been really exacerbated. The CLA is a measure used, it actually applies to the tax rate, but it's a measure used to compare values of properties as they're listed by towns to fair market value. So when the CLA it's never perfectly at 100%, but when it's way above 100% or way below 100%, which with residential properties is more often the case right now, it sort of triggers a reappraisal by the town. So there is a division within the Department of Taxes, it's PDR, and I hope I haven't used that I tried to take out as many acronyms as possible, but I apologize if I left some of those in. It's Property Valuation and Review. They do a study every year. It's based on 3 years of data to calculate the CLA for each town. So when a town gets an order from PVR, they are then required to reappraise all the properties in their town so that they can bring them back up to, as close to fair market value as possible. So there are a lot of towns right now that are currently under reappraisal orders. So when I said the sort of most urgent issue that this bill attempts to address is repealing that CLA trigger. So as of July 1st of 2023, but it does have a look back. It goes all the way back to grand lists that have been filed since April 1st, 2022. So any town that has not already commenced a reappraisal, going back to last year, would no longer be required under statute to conduct a reappraisal. So it's a sort of a hold harmless. So that's issue number 1.
Okay.
And then I'll walk you through the actual bill if you'd like.
Yeah, no, this is
Details
good.
you'd like.
Yeah.
The next big issue that the bill takes sort of 2 approaches to is shifting reappraisals from a municipal responsibility to a state responsibility. It does not do that immediately. And that's where the timeline is really important to remember. It does not automatically, as of July 1st, shift everything over to the state. It does it in phases. And very importantly, the bulk of this bill, actually a lot of the language that you see are reporting requirements. So there is a phase in of 2 different issues, but also 2 different reports from the Department of Taxes. And one of the biggest issues in a lot of the language that's in here is addressing how to shift reappraisals from towns to the state. So those are the really big issues. And then I can dive into what I see as some of the issues that are in your jurisdiction, but I'd be happy to talk about the tax issues and then the appropriations as well. So there are a lot of different things happening in the bill.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful for us to understand the whole bill. And I know that it will travel to the money committees after we take a look at it, but wanting to,
Absolutely.
especially since not everybody on the committee probably has dug into this stuff before.
Yes, and please stop me if I'm talking too quickly or using too many.
Do you have a clarification question?
Kind of.
Okay, go for it.
So my question, and maybe this is addressed in the timelines, like housing costs have skyrocketed due to COVID and there could be a bubble burst like we saw historically. Does this account for this in any way, or is this just going to sort of blanket have these massive rises in appraisal value?
So
Obviously, I don't expect you to predict the future,
Yeah.
but I recognize that the increase due to COVID is a little bit artificially fast, and I just
Right.
I don't know if this threads that needle and addresses that in any way.
the CLA, and there's also the coefficient of dispersion. I didn't get into that level of detail. There's another trigger for reappraisals, and it's based on properties within a town, whether they're being sort of fairly or equitably appraised. So that trigger is still retained in the bill. So you're still looking at property valuation in each town. The CLA itself is not going away, so that would still apply to the tax rate. The department still would conduct the equalization study, which is that 3-year period of looking at actual sales. So sales then did plummet. That study would take those changes into account. And it's also over 3 years. So it's also, as the pandemic has had this impact, it's been a slow waterfall effect of, it wasn't an initial, oh, property values have suddenly skyrocketed, so the CLA is also automatically skyrocketed. It was a progressive increase. So it does not directly address that, but there is that process in place now to sort of be sensitive to that.
Yeah, so why don't we go through the bill, because I think it's more of a process procedure bill than addressing specifically what you're asking, if I'm understanding your question.
Okay.
So
Yes, that's all sort of in the background. That's not what the bill is directly addressing or changing. Although again, the CLA as a trigger for reappraisals is being repealed in this bill. So maybe it would be helpful if I walk through the section by section.
Yeah.
summary,
I think that's good.
And then I'll sort of flip back and forth to the timeline because it is laid out somewhat chronologically, just to keep, but also because there's one section that is amended 3 times or 4 times in multiple sections, which then have different effective dates. So looking at the language, if you are confused. feel free to
Yeah, I
ask
think that,
questions.
can I just stop you for just a second? I want to make sure. Representative Kornheiser, do you have a time crunch?
4:30.
4:30. And what about you? Do you have time crunch?
More or less 4:30, but I'm flexible.
Okay, so you're in the seat, so we're gonna go with you if you, do you mind? That's okay. I'm sure you do. So go ahead and we'll hear from Representative Kornheiser.
So in the first section, it's findings. So it does list different national statistics and then Vermont specific statistics about particularly the reappraisal process and the number of towns that are under an order currently. So I won't, unless you have questions about that, I'll keep going into sort of the meat of what's changing. Findings or statements, not changes to the law. Section 2, so it's this, it's 3 times, this section of statute in Title 32 on required reappraisals. That's the section that's amended 3 different times because it's at 3 different points in time. So the first is striking that trigger of the CLA for towns to have to reappraise. It does retain the coefficient of dispersion. It has a very technical change where there's currently an appropriation of $100,000 to fund education by property valuation and review for listers and assessors. It's struck from this section. It's actually just reenacted into a different section that's on lister education. So it's more of a technical change. It's just shifted. So that is effective on passage. As I mentioned, that the CLA trigger going away does apply retroactively to grand lists on April 1st of 2022. the next change is to the same section, and this gets into more of the funding side. It repeals the $8.50 per parcel fee that's paid from the state to municipalities for the cost of reappraisals. That's not effective until 2026, the very beginning of 2026. And that, if you look at section 4, is sort of interacting with the appropriations that would be happening at that time. In the second subsection, there is a fiscal year 26 appropriation to the Department of Taxes to fund a state reappraisal program. So the removal of the $8.50 fee would then be able to be sort of scooped and used for paying the department to create a state program. In that appropriations section, just to highlight just immediately, so July 1st of 2023, there would be $50,000 being appropriated to the Department of Taxes for contracting out the work that the bill requires for a pretty substantial study. Several reports and one very substantial study. And I'll get into that shortly. So the third change to this same section 4041A on required reappraisals is taking effect on July 1st of 2026. So this is the part that's really pushing out the effective date to give time for the study to come back from the department and for more sort of work to be done around how this would be created. So it does repeal municipalities having to reappraise. It retains the COD as a trigger, but it would be triggering a state reappraisal instead of a town reappraisal. And then, of course, it repeals the penalty related to a failure to reappraise. Sort of clean up. Okay, so I will pause there and then I will launch into the study.
So the COD remains a trigger, but the CLA just never comes back as a trigger. Okay.
And it's still retained as a tax rate adjustment.
Okay. Senator White.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just so I understand kind of jurisdictionally where our committee falls on this, what parts, or do we have jurisdiction over the entirety of the bill and sections go to finance, or are we?
So that is a conversation that the chair of finance and I will have. This bill will undoubtedly go to finance after us, and then it will go to appropriations.
Okay.
So we're gonna look at the whole bill and make sure it works from a government operations perspective. So,
Okay.
you know, because so much of it is procedural and the interaction between municipal governments and what they're required to do right now versus this change, making it a state requirement. So that's really where that bread and butter is. And then the fact that it's a tax department issue is no different than if it were human services or agency of human services. It's the way government functions. So that's why.
Oh, no, I completely understand. I just didn't know if there were parts that we were not going to be spending time on in the same.
We're gonna look at the whole thing, partly because the chair loves this stuff. So we're gonna look at the whole
This
thing.
chair? Great. Okay. Can I ask a subsequent question on that?
Yes.
How long did House Government Operations spend on the bill?
Not aware of that. I do not know.
Did they receive the bill? And did they look over the bill?
We can ask
Sure.
Representative
Okay.
Kornheiser when she's in the hot seat about how it traveled in the House.
Okay.
I'm not really the best person to ask. so-
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank
but
you.
I can
All
try.
right, carry on.
I'm sorry, I was skipping ahead thinking already about the study. The next section is section 6. So this is a section of statute that has not actually taken effect yet. It was enacted last session with a contingent effective date and a prospective contingent effective date. And it was to address a more targeted issue of complex or unique property valuations of dams, for example, hydro dams in particular are sort of the classic example. The changes in this bill would expand the scope of this program that's being created at the Department of Taxes. So rather than a targeted appraisal and litigation assistance program for unique and complex properties, it would also be kind of like 2 programs. It would also have an appraisal program for all municipalities in the state. It requires the Commissioner of Taxes to determine a reappraisal schedule because it wouldn't necessarily be every town, every set period of time. It does have two types of appraisals, and I'm not an appraiser, so I'm not the best person to speak to how these are conducted, but there are different types of appraisals. Statistical are sort of targeted types of properties on a grand list within a municipality, and then a full reappraisal is the entire property grand list in a municipality. So the periods of time are specified only for full reappraisals every 6 years. The statistical is left open either for future legislative development or the way it's drafted. It could be a commissioner discretion to determine how frequent those need to be. It does include language stating that when the state has set the grand list for a town that's binding on the municipality, that's the state's prerogative. And then it would also appropriate annually. So this is after that initial fiscal year 26 appropriation. It would appropriate, here it has a set dollar amount. It's based on the $8.50 per parcel fee minus $1 per parcel, because there's another per parcel fee that's increased. And that's the next section.
Yeah.
Because there are actually two under current statute. So that leads perfectly into section 7, which doubles from $1 to $2, another per parcel fee, which is currently authorized for the equalization study that assistance towns provide to the department. And it expands the use of that for towns, that it can also be used for the grand list generally. Section 8 is the implementation plan, and actually there's sort of 2 progress reports that are required of the department. And I know the chair is very, very familiar with one of these issues. Perhaps both, sorry.
Education.
Presume. So there are 2 real issues that have been discussed at length for several years. The first is implementing an Office of Statewide Reappraisals. There's also the issue of categorizing properties on the grand list, both non-homestead and homestead, and both municipal and state grand lists. So the first report is a progress report at the end of this year from the Department of Taxes to the legislature. The second is the in-depth report on those same 2 issues, and I'd be happy to walk you through everything that's in the report or leave it at that. There are a lot of issues that are addressed, notably required to be addressed, notably an appeal structure, if there kind of what changes would need to be made, if any changes need to be made, as well as staffing structure for ensuring that there are reappraisers throughout the state.
Do you want to hear more of the details about the report? Are you okay with that? I actually would like to hear a little bit more, if you have you walk us through,
Sure.
you know, not
They're
super
big categories.
tight,
The
Yeah.
people
Yeah,
waiting
yeah.
piece, is that? That's section 8.
Okay, so this is the second report that's due at the end of 2024. Just if you did want to follow along, it starts on page 11 of the bill. Subdivision 3 on line 5 references the first report on the creation of the statewide Office of Reappraisal. So the first, so it's a recommendation and proposed legislative language. Adequate funding, notably staffing costs for hiring or for contracting. I'm sorry, I didn't point that out, but the language does in statute would authorize the department to contract out for appraisers. And again, not the best place to talk to you about the current state of reappraisals and staff, trained staff, but yes, whether there are enough, and hiring is an issue. It's just generally a across the board lack of trained individuals. So that's one of the deliverables in the report, is how to address hiring. The next issue is administering all of these reappraisals, the selection prioritization criteria, scheduling, frequency, and then any other recommendations. Also, there is language regarding reappraisals of municipalities that either are very recently reappraised or have not reappraised in a very long time. So prioritizing some and making sure that those who recently reappraised aren't also first up to reappraise shortly after this would take effect. As I mentioned, there would be recommendations around an appeal structure. So currently, there's a grievance from listers or grievance to lister decisions by individual property owners, and then that an appeal from a grievance goes to the Board of Civil Authority, and then either taxpayers or the town can appeal to Superior Court or to the Director of Property Valuation and Review. So would that structure be maintained, given that towns would no longer be reappraising? Would that become an appeal structure within the department? This bill does not address that. There are no changes to the appeal structure right now in this bill.
Yeah, okay, I guess I do have some questions about that.
Why don't we get the full overview and we will dig into how this works and, yeah.
Yes, and the timeline's important because again, the shift from towns to the state of the statewide reappraisal office does not happen until 2026. So 2 sessions after the department's report with information about this there will be 2 sessions to work on this further.
Well, okay, I guess I just don't understand how tax abatements would fit into this in the appeals process, or is that, because we have lucked out and like our appraiser will come in and then, you know, talk to us about it, but you'd have to have the state would be doing it in that case, but you don't posit an answer to that question here.
Yes, there is no answer to that question.
Okay.
In this bill.
This is an interesting one.
Yes, but it is important to remember that so generally appraisals would be happening by the town is because reappraisals that would be shifting. So
Okay, so that wouldn't really affect anyone who's coming to abate their taxes, other than like a reappraisal year.
Yes, I think that's correct. Yes, so just either a partial or full reappraisal. So it does get complex quickly, which is why there are a lot of deliverables around the appeal structure. So impartiality, procedural safeguards, ensuring access for different communities, looking at other state administrative appeal structures, because lots of every department or agency has some sort of appeal structure, of some sort. And anything else, so specifically on either narrowing or eliminating the role of the BCA.
Yeah, exactly.
So that the town's the kicker. So there is that delay in the effective date. So this is required at the end of 2024, and then the current bill effective date would make the shift of reappraisals to the state effective in 2026.
Okay.
Oh, that would be a big change.
All right, carry on.
Okay, several other issues that were flagged and are being required from the department to report back are software vendor agreements. So both towns and the state have different software regarding the grand list. So this would be requiring the department to consider integrating those and different issues around switching to statewide reappraisal and how that would impact software vendor agreements. Also, it requires a cost estimate. There's sort of a couple of weedier issues in here about mapping and contiguous parcels for purposes of the grand list. So it requires some recommendations around parsing out the parcels. 2 issues there, and then overall taking into account principles of a high quality tax system, which are principles generally accepted by states, and then NCSL in particular has a list of those that tax policy committees often refer back to.
The tax policy handbook for state legislators. I wonder who in the room has memorized that.
So that is the moving to a statewide office of reappraisal report. There is a second report and detailed plan also required from the department relating to different categories of property and recommendations with legislative language around how to reconfigure and consolidate the existing categories on the grand list. Because under current statute, there's only homestead, which is primary dwellings, and non-homestead. And then grand lists do break out by residential, seasonal, but they're not necessarily uniformly applied across the state, and they're not necessarily the data that policymakers have wanted to have access to. So this requires an in-depth study and plan as to how to get at different types of data.
To reorganize, not necessarily to consolidate them.
The language says that reconfigures and consolidates.
Okay, think about that.
Yes. There are different ways to get at the data. It does require guidance to be provided as well, as to how this would be implemented and rolled out, because it would impact property owners, municipal administrators, and state administrators. And then assistance provided for listers in particular, because given the way the grand list is currently set and maintained by towns, if no change were made to statute, then categorizing new properties would become a municipal lister requirement. So assistance that would need to be provided, or other recommendations about how to actually conduct categorization. And then lastly, how to integrate new categories into the new statewide reappraisal program. That is section 8 with the studies and the reports.
Okay.
After this, it gets a little more technical, but there are some changes to lister education that you should be aware of. First, in section 9, I did mention there was last session, the unique or complex property litigation assistance program. It had a contingent effective date. So that contingency is repealed, so it will take effect if this bill takes effect. The contingency was that the General Assembly appropriated enough money to cover the cost of the department operating that new program. So the contingency goes away under this bill and it will take effect. The next piece.
Are you feeling okay?
I'm just having a scratchy throat, so I'm wearing my mask.
The next couple of sections are somewhat more technical, but do have some substantive changes to lister and appraiser education. So if you bear with me,
Okay.
we'll try and tell you what current statute is versus what this would change. So it would impose the same requirements on elected listers that hired appraisers. So if a town votes to hire appraisers instead of electing listers, often if they don't have enough listers, there are slightly different requirements for appraisers. And especially with reappraisal, it's an even higher standard. So it would impose the same education requirements on elected listers as those that are imposed on appraisers. They're not vastly different, and listers already do have some requirements for education and training. And there's, as I mentioned, there's a $100,000 appropriation already annually. So listers are voluntarily able to get more training and some very professionalized training as well. But this would make that training mandatory. And currently the instruction that's provided by property valuation review is only required by one lister or more if the town requires. So, and there is a property valuation review rule, administrative rule that applies for contracted appraisers. So the bill does not address how listers who haven't been doing it, there are any listers who are not up to date because current statute only requires one per town. The bill doesn't explicitly state whether they have to come or when they have to come into compliance with training. So that's just one thing to keep in mind.
Okay.
So that is in sections 10. Section 10 also moved that $100,000 appropriation into this assessment education section, just as sort of a technical cleanup. It did not change anything in the language. Section 11 is again about assessor and lister qualifications. And section 12 is the same, so it's a lot of, because that's actually in Title 17, so it's sort of cross-referencing the education requirements.
Okay.
I don't know if you either walk through that or.
No, I think we're good, because we're gonna run out of time. Yeah.
And then section 13 is conforming revisions. It's a conforming revision authority being given to my office, the Office of Legislative Counsel, to make revisions throughout Title 32 that do not have a substantive impact, but given that the shift from municipalities to the state, to replace reappraisal with appraisal where necessary. And there isn't a specific date because of the effective date being later. So it's open, it will be an ongoing revision authority. In the summer, we revised statute and the white book, the green book.
Yeah, we know all about that.
Haikus and
Yeah,
everything.
haikus
And limericks.
Oh.
Yeah,
Very fresh.
I'll talk about the limericks.
I don't think I need to go through the effective dates because I've tried to explain that throughout, but I'd be happy to take any other questions if you guys.
Senator White?
Are there any sections of the bill that look at the software or programs that towns use?
So there is that requirement that the study take that into account, but nothing directly.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Abby? Thank you. We will definitely have you back as we go through this, obviously, so appreciate the walkthrough. Thank you. Representative Kornheiser. Hi,
Hi,
how are you?
I'm great.
I was excited to get this bill.
Yes, so
So tell us what you want us to know.
Representative Emily Kornheiser, for the record, I'm the chair of House Ways and Means from Brattleboro. And this bill is sort of my committee's nerdy offering to the universe and offering to you all. We did not begin the session planning on tackling all of these issues. But we're working with two separate bills that Abby was drafting, both of them, and we kept on starting to reference one bill with the other as we were going and eventually decided to put them together into one committee bill. So I want to talk about the problems we were trying to solve because they're very disparate problems that I think are all solved within this bill. So one is there are towns all over the state that have been required to reappraise. Most of those towns that were required to reappraise have not reappraised in a very long time. So the problem with them that we were sort of trying to solve was not, oh no, we're requiring towns to reappraise. It was towns are not reappraising regularly enough. And that has created a bit of a bottleneck now that they are.
Yeah.
And municipalities are reappraising on such a tiny, tiny, tiny scale that they're not able to hire reappraisal firms because the contracts are too small for anyone to want to bid on them. We also heard from folks who are doing reappraisals that given these sort of very tiny reappraisal communities, it was really hard to make decisions about reappraisals given that only a couple properties might change hands a year. And so moving to sort of a larger swath of property in order to reappraise was both a solution to the contractual problems that municipalities are offering with reappraisals, a solution to the consistency problem that we're having with this bottleneck, and an opportunity to get more accurate reappraisals. We also, in sort of diving into that, realized that, no one else really does this the way that Vermont does this, which is not an unusual thing to encounter when working through Vermont state statute, but seemed particularly extraordinary in this context. Second problem that we were trying to solve is as we were sort of, and this is, as we were exploring sort of the racial justice reckoning in previous biennium, and this was becoming more of an issue for folks, I personally started diving into like, okay, what can I do in tax policy around racial justice? Because other committees get to do all of this really fun work. And I don't really understand where my responsibility lies in this. And so I did a bunch of research, read a bunch of books, went to conferences, and spent some time with Susanna Davis on this issue. And one issue that is true both nationally and in Vermont, research has happened in both places, and that I have heard about both at national conferences and from Susanna here, and we have heard some great testimony from her that I really recommend you take a look at, was that there is a national trend and a trend in Vermont to essentially overvalue properties for lower value properties for the purposes of grant lists, right? So folks with lower incomes and lower value properties are paying more than their fair share of property taxes, and then undervalue high value homes. So there's sort of like a tendency towards the mean in valuation of properties that hurts lower income or lower value property owners and helps sort of the financial situation of higher wealth individuals, but sort of hurts our overall tax capacity. And this is true. And in doing that, we are both perpetuating the racial wealth gap, but we're also perpetuating the overall wealth gap between rich and poor in Vermont and nationally. And there's a lot of really great testimony on that, both from Susanna Davis, and this is actually something that the principal of Urban Free Consulting, who came into our room under a totally different conversation topic, has also done a lot of research on. He's the person that's been sort of talking about land value taxes around the building. Joe Listigi. Okay, so Joe Listigi also has done a huge amount of research separate from his land value tax work on this sort of bias in appraisals. And again, they're not like individual people being racist or biased. This is just a tendency of the overall system. So I want to say that for like the millionth time because I've got some emails. So, and because it's important for people to keep.
I'm starting to get those emails.
Yes,
too.
great. So there's that piece of it. And then so on the flip side, for the sale of properties, the opposite happens. And so people are getting sort of lower appraisals when they are trying to sell, which means they make less money when they sell it. So anyway, so we wanted to make a difference on this, like, you know, bias in our system that both hurts our overall state revenues and hurts individuals who are experiencing Vermont. And then the third problem we were trying to solve, which is important from the land value tax perspective, it's important from if we are going to really tackle some issues around the tax responsibilities of rental properties or non-residential properties or all kinds of different sort of policy concerns that I think many people at this table have actually tried to tackle themselves. I've had conversations with many of you about this. The way that our homestead and non-homestead taxes are structured right now, it's really virtually impossible to make selective decisions around even just having the data we need to make good decisions about setting sort of more discrete taxes or more policy focused taxes around land use and property use in our tax structure without having a grand list that is both consistent with our homestead and non-homestead categories and consistent from community to community. And I, really appreciate the continued participation from the Department of Taxes, in particular PBR, in sort of exploring this with us and saying, like, we really can't advise you on this issue because what is, sort of considered definitionally something in one community might be different definitionally in another community. And, Representative Conlon, who's from Chair Hardy's district, keeps on bringing this bill about trailer coaches and the valuation of trailer coaches to our committee. And it's just like this funny little example of how something is appraised one way in his community and not appraised that way anywhere else in the state. And so it's an interesting thing. And it's just because, we evolve these systems over time. We have guidelines set to them, but we have laws that were sort of set for the 1 century, and we're moving into a new century, and we need to figure out ways to modernize our grand list so that they're ready to tackle the really profound tax structure that we want, a modern tax structure, and a modern land use structure connected to that tax structure. So those are the 3 problems we were trying to solve. It was kind of like a big problem-solving chunk to take, and really wanted to trust the experts on this, which is, the Listers Association, Department of Taxes, PBR, within the Department of Taxes. And so we set up this really funny stage structure because there's an urgent problem right now. And we know that communities were asking us to do something about this reappraisal problem. And so we want to respond to the urgency. But there were things that were really going to take time and like really deep collaboration to figure out, like the appeal structure. And so we set up the system where we're putting systems in place that people need to respond to, and that there's an end and a solution in sight, but not making decisions before we were entirely ready to. And so that's why we set up for this 5-stage structure, this, sort of 5-step structure that I'm pretty excited about. The studies aren't just studies, they're really implementation plans, because we've asked TAX to study this issues a little bit before, but this is taking the next step of saying, please don't just like study the grand list. Tell us if you were going to consolidate the grand list or change the categories in the grand list so they lined up with homestead and non-homestead, what would that look like for you? Because we had a bill on our wall that we were picking together, where we were like smushing we were adding new definitions to grand list categories, dividing up the non-homestead and the homestead categories into, rental properties, non-residential homes, things like that. But we were running up against how it collided with the grand list and not really able to find a definite answer. And so that is why we sort of asked for an implementation plan related to that debate we were having. So that's the bill. I have a big crush on it. I hope you do too. It was definitely like, it's not, we did not go in being like, this is the policy problem we're trying to solve this year. These were the problems that were in front of us that are required to be solved in order to solve other really pressing problems in front of us. And so I hope you have a really good time with it. Thanks for doing that.
You're welcome. Are there questions? Cornhusker?
Much too many to be answered at this time of day.
Well, I'm upstairs anytime, but I'm also happy to come downstairs and chat with you anytime.
Well, I'd like the committee to hear the rest of it, obviously, but,
Yeah, we'll definitely dig in some more on this. Senator Watson.
I do have more questions, but I also want to recognize it's after 4:30.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Actually,
So-
hold on.
Yeah, and so do I. So,
Okay.
thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Abby. Nice to see you, Rebecca. We'll definitely have you in.
I really am happy to come back though.
Yeah, we might have you back to have more of a chat. So, thank you,